Hey, and welcome to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. Today is day 103 on your calendar. That puts us at April, I think 12th. Yeah, April 12th. And today's reading is 1 Chronicles 9:35 through 39, and then 1 Samuel 13 and 14. And on your reading plan, you're going to notice that 1 Samuel 13 is broken up into it's out of order numerically. And so you're going to see that the reading is a little bit all over the place, but it's still the entire chapter of 13 and 14. So that's the reading that we have for today. Bible 365 is reading through your Bible in 1 year. And I'm reading through using the 1 Year Chronological Bible reading plan, which you can find online at the 1 Year Chronological Bible online.com. And you can download your free reading plan. And that's going to put you in the same exact order as me. So if you are doing any other chronological plan, will probably be similar, but maybe not exactly the same. So some things will be a little bit different. So if you are doing this for the first time, just make sure you jump on that reading plan so you won't get confused about our timeline. All right, so we are in the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel is one of the last judges the last judge that is brought up because now we are in the time of kings. So they have just appointed Saul as king yesterday. We just appointed Saul as king, the Israelites. And we're still in the 12 tribes. So these 12 tribes that were rescued out of Egypt are now living in the land of Canaan, so sort of in and around the land of Canaan and also a little bit on the outside of the land of Canaan. And that encompasses all 12 tribes. And so now they have appointed a king. Samuel, through God, has appointed a king, and it is Saul, and he is leading all of the Israelite people. So all of the 12 tribes come under the rule of King Saul. And they are currently in a war with the Philistines. The Philistines are actually living in the land of Israel. So they're kind of on the outside edge near the water on the land of Israel. I believe living in the area of the tribe of Judah, a little bit in the area of the tribe of Manasseh. So they're kind of in that area outside towards the water, and that's where they're living. And so it's sort of an internal war, but they're trying to drive out the Philistines. So that's all the background I'm going to give you. If you have never been with me before today, I would recommend that after you listen today, if you like this and you listen and it helps you understand the reading at all, I would recommend going all the way back to Genesis 1 and starting from the foundation to build everything up, because this is a huge building block that we're coming into, and it's too hard to go back to the beginning to come back to today, where we are today. So anyway, starting today in First Chronicles, and so this just gives you a little bit of a family tree of Saul, who his family is. So in First Chronicles, it says Jael, the father of Gibeon, lived in Gibeon, and so we have his wife, and then we have his children that follow. And Kish is one of those children, and Kish is the father of Saul. So in verse 39, it says Ner was the father of Kish, which I want to go over what that means. Ner was the father of Kish, Kish the father of Saul, and Saul the father of Jonathan. Saul is currently the king. Jonathan is his son, and we see a lot of Jonathan coming up in this. So when it says Jael is the father, we can see that he's not. Ner is the father of Kish. And so just a little bit of maybe understanding of what that means, because in this, we see a lot of this familiar stuff in here. And I know I've gone over it before, but it could mean that he's a great, 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 great grandfather, right? So it could go far back. And so they say father, but they really mean a descendant. Or it could mean that he's the head of their clan, of their tribe, in the tribe of Benjamin. So just to be aware that father, yes, means father, but doesn't necessarily mean direct father, doesn't mean father and son. It could mean any number of familial type relationships that a father would entail. So he could be a leader. So even it could be a military leader. So it just depends on the context in which it is. And I'm going to say we can know that it is not his actual father, because we see that Kish's actual father is Ner. And so it will be a different father than Jael. So just putting that out there. So we have just more of an understanding of how we read things when things come across. Is it being hypocritical, or is it condemning itself by not telling the truth? Or is it just a misunderstanding that we have, right? So hoping to answer some of those questions. All right. So now, because this is another thing in here that drove me crazy. Coming in here now, we are in verse 1. We're talking about the war with Saul and the Philistines, right? So it says Saul was 30 years old in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 13. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. So he had a 42-year reign in Israel. And we're just going to go over here some of the battles that he was in. So he went from geographically, because this drove me crazy the way we jumped around a little bit. Geographically, he went from Michmash, which is where he started, and then this is where a Philistine outpost was, and then he went to Gilead, and then he went to Gibeah. Gibeah seemed to be where he lived, so him and Jonathan kind of had maybe their home base there. That was where the area in which they lived, and so they went there. So he went from place to place to place. So we see Jonathan, it looks like, just went to Gibeah. So it doesn't really say that Jonathan is following him around. Jonathan, who is his son, just went to Gibeah. So the troops split. Saul took some of his troops in one location. Jonathan took some of the troops into another location. And then Saul moved from place to place. So I'm hoping that might help settle you visually in an understanding of what's coming up. So Saul starts out in Michmash. He starts out with 2,000 of the 3,000 people, and 1,000 of them went with Jonathan. And then he attacks the Philistines. The Philistines are losing. They're sad. They're upset about it. And then in verse 5, it says, the Philistines assemble to fight Israel. They have many more people than Israel does. So here they have 3,000 chariots. They have soldiers as numerous as the sands, 6,000 charioteers. And then they go up and they go to fight Saul. In this area, what we can see is that in sort of like this next section that we're in, what we can see is that the Israelites do not have what? So they're outnumbered, they're outmanned, they're outweaponed, right? They don't have, it looks as if there's no chance that they could possibly win this battle, but God, of course, which is one of the things that we find out. So, and then it says that the Israelites believe that their situation is critical, and then they start hiding. So everyone gets a little scared, and then they start hiding. And so Saul remains in Gilgal. So moving down to verse 7, everybody's scared, and then he waits 7 days. So if you guys remember, Saul, it may have been yesterday. So Saul says, I'm going to go to I'm going to go back a little bit. So it says Saul says that he has to wait for him for 3 days. So if we go back to 1 Samuel 10, he says in verse 8, he says, go down ahead of me. Samuel says this to Saul, go down ahead of me to Gilgal. So here's where we are. I'm surely going to come down with you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you're to do. So Samuel's going to come to him, and Saul needs to wait because Samuel's going to be the one that tells him what to do. Remember, Samuel's the one that's conferring with God. He's the one that's speaking to God. Saul is the king. Samuel is the prophet that's speaking to God at this time. And so Samuel says to Saul, go down here, set everything up, right? Do all that camp thing. You're the king now, so set everything up, prepare everybody, and then I'm going to come down, and then I'm going to give the burnt offerings. I'm going to talk to God, and then God's going to tell us how to proceed. I've added a little bit that, but hopefully that helps you understand the way in which that this was supposed to run, because then we understand why Samuel gets so upset. Now we can see that Saul doesn't wait. Saul gets a little freaked out because Samuel doesn't come in the 7 days. So it says, Saul offered up the burnt offerings. Just as he finished making the offerings, then Samuel arrives and Saul goes out to greet him. So I just want to read this because Samuel's upset. What have you done? Saul replies, when I saw that the men, so here are some of the reasons that Saul does what he does. I see that the men are scattering. You did not come at the set time you told me you were going to come. The Philistines were assembling. So remember, they're outmanned, they're outweaponed. And so Saul says, and so he says, the Philistines are going to come down against me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offerings. And I don't want to say this in defense of Saul. I just want to say this in sort of an understanding of why. So he looks around. Samuel says, I'm going to be in there in the 7 days. The 7 days kind of comes and goes, and he doesn't see Samuel yet. And he starts to see that everyone's getting freaked out. And because everyone's getting freaked out, he's like, oh yeah, I just realized I didn't ask the Lord for his blessing. So he brings the burnt offerings. The problem with Saul bringing the burnt offerings is Saul is not the priest. He's not the one that's supposed to be bringing the burnt offerings. He's the king. He's the one that's supposed to be leading them in the war, but he's not the one who's supposed to be offering burnt offerings to the Lord. So again, this is this idea of, in a way, which sounds rude, in a way, knowing your place, right? This is, you are specifically there for a specific reason, and God was open about this. It's not even like you're sitting in prayer and going, what's my purpose, what am I supposed to do, and not knowing what you're supposed to do, so proceeding in a certain way. This wasn't true. Saul was given this information by Samuel, and Samuel was given this information by the Lord. And it was known that Samuel was a prophet, and it was also known that Samuel's prophecies did not go bad, right? So these were all things that Saul should have been aware of when he was recognized as king. And so in his, and again, I don't want to negate the fact that I understand, but I also want to be clear that just because you understand doesn't mean that it was the right thing to do, or doesn't mean because, well, I understand, so then he shouldn't pay any price for that, or he shouldn't get in trouble for that, or you think to yourself, I may or may not have done something like that before, and do I have to pay the price for that, right? So just because we understand and we can sympathize, which is a great thing that we should be able to do, it doesn't mean we should excuse it. So we have to just be aware of both things: gentle kindness, forgiveness in our understanding that we may or may not have done the same thing, but not excusing that God has God's ways and their ways are right. God's ways are right. All right. So then Samuel follows with, you've done a foolish thing and you haven't kept the command of God that I gave you. And then he says in verse 14, but now your kingdom will not endure. And I just want to make a note of this as well, because here's another weird, I don't know, I want to say journalistic trait or thing about writing, right? So he says, or even the things that God promises. He says, your kingdom will not endure. And yet we see over here where it says in verse 1 Samuel 13:1, it says Saul was 30. So I'm going to say 30 when he became king. This seems like it's the beginning of his kingship. And he reigns over Israel for 42 years. So it looks like this is the beginning and it lasts for 42 years. So how can Samuel say his kingdom won't endure? It endures for 42 years. Let's keep reading and maybe we'll understand better what that means, what God and Samuel mean by enduring or not enduring, right? So we probably think 42 years is a really long time. Just had a coughing fit off camera, sorry. Hopefully I didn't mess this up too much. All right. So we're going to have to see in the future what it means to endure. What does God mean by the kingdom will not, his kingdom will not endure, or he will not endure in his kingdom? What does he say exactly? He says, now your kingdom, right? Your kingdom will not endure. So we'll have to see what that means. All right. So we're going to move on. Now we're starting to go. So now Samuel leaves him. So Saul's still up in Gilgal. Samuel leaves him, but it seems like at the same time Saul starts to come down. But at this time, what we do see is how Saul started out with 2,000 people, and now he only has 600 people. So people either died, which we don't necessarily hear about, but they did flee. If you remember, they flee and they fled and they hid in caves. All right, so a little bit of dog barking. I apologize. I'm having all kinds of issues today. Anyway, Saul has come down with 600 people, which was less than what he had. But he comes down with 600 people. In this group of 600 people that he comes down with to meet Jonathan down here to continue the war against the Philistines, in this group of 600 is, and I want to note this because of what I mentioned a couple of days ago, it was Ahijah is with them. And he is wearing an ephod, which means he's one of the high priests. So he was the son of Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli. So this is still in the house of Eli. So it looks like maybe that line hasn't finished yet, or but it's still in the house of Aaron, that we are certain of. And Ichabod is, so this is a relation to Ichabod. Ichabod is, so because it's Ichabod's brother. Ichabod is the son that was born from Eli's daughter-in-law. So again, it looks like it's still in that house. So I'm not sure when and if that prophecy has not been fulfilled yet, or if Ichabod's brother maybe makes it a distinction because it's not really the sons of, well, it's still the son of Eli. So I'm not 100% sure how this, when or how this prophecy fulfills itself. But what we can see now is it is still in this family, is still in the family of Aaron. So that hasn't ended. And so that was probably a mistake on my part when I was reading it the first time, that it still stays in the house of Aaron. It's just Eli and his sons that die. All right. So he's with them. And obviously they wanted to know that he was with them. And so they have a high priest with them, but they weren't aware that Jonathan left. So Jonathan leaves and he goes with his servant and or his armor bearer, I shouldn't say a servant, and the two of them go up this hill into this sort of like mini battle. And he's really blatant about, and I can appreciate this in some ways. He's really blatant about what he does. He says, if I go up there and I see these people and they say, come to me, then we know the Lord has put them in our hands and we can go and take them. If they don't say that, then obviously they're not. So if I read 8, it says, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say, wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up. But if they say, come up, we'll climb up, because that's our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. And this is what happens. The Lord says, and then they climb up. So the Lord said, they say, come to us. And so they go up and they kill 20 men. Just the two of them kill 20 men, which if we watch movies now, that probably doesn't seem like a really big deal. But if we recognize real life, that's actually a hugely big deal. One person for 10 people is ridiculously outnumbered. And so the chance of them winning would have been practically none. I mean, I'm going to say none, but the Lord was with them. And so they won 20-2. And I want to note this because I think this is one of those areas in which we kind of walk away with a lesson that would be like, oh, if you really believe in your heart, then you can do anything. And in some ways, I would agree that that's true. But I want to be really clear that Jonathan was 100% certain that the Lord would do what the Lord would do. So he didn't walk in there going, maybe I should say this or maybe I should say that. So he had 100% faith and certainty that whatever the Lord said, he would follow, by the way. And then God would do any of the things that he said. So in other words, in some ways, he gave God two options. If they say this, then this happens. If they say that, then that happens. So he was certain that the Lord was listening and that the Lord was providing for him. And then he was certain that whatever God gave him, the Lord gave him, that he would do, he would fulfill. So he says, if they say this, then we're going to run up there and we're going to capture them. Or we're going to kill them. We're going to go into battle with them. And so I think there was a certainty in Jonathan's heart over who the Lord was and the way that the Lord loved, cared for, and was very individually with the Israelite people. So I think that this is a really strong faith for Jonathan, a really strong understanding of the Lord and his presence and and what he would do for them. So, and he was certainly also willing to say that if God doesn't give them into our hands, then we're not going to go up there and take them. So he wasn't going to do anything that God didn't want him to do. All right. So I want to move on from this down into this next section. So moving on to 1 Samuel 14:16, it says, when Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions, Saul said to the men with them that bring up the forces. So this is the thing that really messed with me. So in verse 18, Saul says, bring the ark of God. At that time, it was with the Israelites. And then I just got all messed up. So I just want to throw this out to you the way that my brain thinks. So I got all messed up because the ark was, yes, it was with the Israelites. And I guess my brain didn't process that it was with the Israelites. But it was sitting, and if you remember, the scripture said that it was sitting for 20 years at this one place. And so I thought he couldn't bring the ark of God because it was sitting. And if it was sitting for 20 years, then he couldn't bring it with him. And so I went through all of this timeline. Well, maybe chronologically this was off. Maybe Saul was king when the ark was taken, and he really had. Anyway, I go through all of this without reading the verse after, which says, withdraw your hand. So he said to the priest, withdraw your hand. So he didn't bring the ark with him to battle, which is not unheard of because that was actually things that they did do. Joshua constantly brought the ark into battle. The ark was leading the way. God was leading them into battle into the land of Canaan. So it wasn't unheard of, but they didn't do it in this case. So yes, the ark was in Israel and it was with the Israelites, but it did not move from that location where it said it stayed for 20 years. So just in case you got a little wound up the same way I did, it's better to read it contextually. But even going through all that historical stuff and finding out that information, there's nothing wrong with that as well. So if you get confused, feel free to go back historically and look into things so you get a better understanding so you can recognize what it actually says. All right, so The ark does not come up with him. Needless to say, the ark doesn't come. But then they go to battle and they wind up winning the battle. And then it says, moving on, it says, the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under the oath. So here's a story about his son, Jonathan. Saul had bound them under the oath that said, if no one's allowed to eat before this evening and before he has avenged himself. So sort of before they won this battle, they weren't allowed to eat. And so what we can see is that they are very hungry. We move right next into Jonathan comes into the picture, who is his son and who doesn't know this vow that Saul has made for the people, because he's made a vow to God for the people. And so Jonathan doesn't recognize this yet. And so he goes in and he sees there's honey in the land. He's starving and he goes and he eats the honey and he feels better. So after he eats the honey, he feels better. He tells the people, let's go eat some honey. And the people say, no, your dad has told us that we can't. Upon death, we're not allowed to eat this honey. And Jonathan essentially says, well, that's terrible. Look how much better I feel after doing that. So I want to read this. So it says, Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of the staff and dipped it in the honey. And then it says in verse 29, Jonathan says, my father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened. So this is sort of a bigger story, right? This isn't just an A and B. So this is a bigger story. Saul didn't do a great thing, right? Saul making the people who are in war, who are going to battle, not able to eat is not good for them. So Saul kind of goes a little off target with this. However, Jonathan, even though he was promised this oath, eats and then tells them he does a terrible thing. So then it says later they got plunder. And then when they plundered everything, the people were so hungry after they were like famished after the battle. And so they ate everything with the blood. And then Saul found out about it, freaked out a little bit. And he said, roll this stone over to me. And so he rolls the stone over and he makes an altar. Note this, that he says, roll this stone away. This is something that we have already seen. We've seen them making stone altars. And one of the things that I believe is where we start making these altars is where God is, right? So God is in around the stone. There's a big purpose to having a stone altar. So he says that. And so here it says, so everyone brought his ox at night and he slaughtered there. It says, roll a large stone over here at once. And then they brought a large ox. They slaughtered it there. Saul built an altar to the Lord. And then he says, let's go pursue. So now he's like, all right, I did all this, built an altar. We're good now. And then he says, let's go plunder. Let's continue to plunder them and just take them out all night. So he says, let's ask the Lord. Asks the Lord, and the Lord doesn't answer. And so he's thinking, why wouldn't the Lord answer? What happened that would make the Lord not answer? Even if it's something with Jonathan, then we need to find out about it. And then Jonathan, even if I have to give up Jonathan. So it says, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. None of them says anything because they all know that it's with Jonathan. And so verse 41, Saul prays to the Lord and says, why haven't you answered me? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, so this is the Urim and Thummim. These are those two things. If you remember, we cast lots. And so he's asking the priest, he's saying he wants him to cast these lots, the Urim and the Thummim. If it lands on the Urim, then it's Jonathan and Saul, that the fault lies with Jonathan and Saul. If it lands on the Thummim, then it's with the rest of the Israelite people. Obviously, it lands on Jonathan and Saul. And then he tests it between the two of them and it lands on Jonathan. And so he can't figure out what happened. And then he says, Jonathan, tell me what you've done. And Jonathan says, I tasted honey and now I must die. Jonathan accepts his fate. He recognizes that obviously even the Lord recognizes that it's Jonathan. He accepts his fate. Saul says, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you don't die, Jonathan. So Saul's also recognizing Jonathan has to die because he broke the vow to the Lord. Obviously, Saul is upset about it, but Saul recognizes that Saul's going to have to be dealt with severely if Jonathan doesn't die. Well, the people freak out. They love Jonathan, and they say Jonathan can't die. So the men say, so if Jonathan dies, who's going to deliver us? And so then the men rescue Jonathan. They protect him. And then Saul stops pursuing the Philistines. So at this point, that battle has ended. However, we see following kind of these next few little verses, there shows some genealogy. But finishing up in 52, it says, all the days of Saul, there was bitter war between the Philistines. And wherever Saul saw a mighty or a brave man, he took him into service. So the rest of Saul's career is bitter. It's a bitter military career. He's always fighting the Philistines. They're always in war. And so that's sort of how we see that he's going to live the rest of his life. I don't know how that changed if he gave up Jonathan. I don't know if it would have or not, but he had already been told by Samuel that his reign, his kingdom was not going to endure. So that's how we're ending today. And so it's a little bit bitter ending it. But that's the way we end. And we're starting tomorrow fresh, and we're going to see what happens there. Tomorrow, we're going to continue into 1 Samuel. If you have found this to be a blessing and it has helped you in any way, helped you understand any of the scripture that you read today, please like this. Please share, subscribe, and comment. I know some of you are commenting. I'm excited to read your comments. So keep commenting in the comment section. I love to hear your thoughts, and maybe share back and forth if at all possible. And keep reading as always. And I will see you guys tomorrow.